There are certain moments in life that split everything cleanly into before and after. For me, that moment happened on a Wednesday evening in October, when I opened a manila envelope left on my own kitchen counter and discovered that the woman I had called my mother-in-law for 4 years had been systematically erasing me from my husband's life on paper, legally, deliberately, while smiling at me across the dinner table every Sunday. I did not scream. I did not cry. I sat down very slowly in the chair by the window, read every single page twice, and then I made myself a cup of coffee. Because I had learned something important about myself by then. I do the most dangerous thinking when I am completely calm. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story only makes sense if you understand exactly what kind of woman my mother-in-law is, and exactly how long it took me to see it clearly. I met my husband at a rooftop fundraiser in downtown Chicago. He was standing near the edge of the crowd, looking slightly uncomfortable in a dress shirt that was just a little too formal for the event, and I thought that was charming. His name was Daniel. He was warm and funny, and he called his mother every single Sunday morning without fail, which I also thought was charming at the time. I was 26 years old and I had grown up in a small town in Ohio with parents who genuinely loved each other, so I had no roadmap for what I was walking into. I thought a man who loved his mother was a good sign. I did not yet understand that there is a very significant difference between a man who loves his mother and a man who has never once in his adult life disagreed with her. His mother's name was Margaret. She was 61 years old, slim, immaculately dressed, and she had the particular talent of delivering an insult so smoothly that it took you a full 30 seconds to realize what had just happened. The first time I met her, she looked me over carefully, smiled, and said, "Daniel has always had such a generous heart. He sees potential in everyone." I smiled back, and told myself I had misheard her. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged. We got married in a small ceremony in the fall, which Margaret loudly described to every guest as intimate in the tone of voice people use when they mean disappointing. I told myself it didn't matter. Daniel loved me. We had a good life. I was a licensed physical therapist with my own caseload and a savings account I had built entirely by myself, and I was proud of that. Margaret was not impressed. She made that clear in the way she talked about my career, always slightly past tense, always with the implication that of course I would eventually step back from all that once the real priorities arrived. The real priorities, in Margaret's view, were grandchildren, the family home in Evanston that Daniel had grown up in, and the estate trust that his late father had established before he died. That trust was worth roughly $8 million. It was structured so that Daniel would receive his inheritance in full upon the birth of his first biological child, a condition his father had written in with the specific and stated goal of ensuring the family line continued. Margaret was the executor of the trust until that condition was met. Until then, she held complete administrative control. I did not fully understand what that meant in practical terms until much later. In the beginning, it was just a fact, like the weather. It sat in the background of our marriage, unremarkable, while Margaret positioned herself in the foreground of everything else. She called Daniel every Sunday. She invited herself to our apartment for dinner at least twice a month. She commented on how I decorated, what I cooked, which neighborhood we lived in, and how I wore my hair. Daniel always laughed it off. "That's just how she is," he would say, every time, and I would breathe through it and move on, because I loved him, and I believed that love was enough to absorb almost anything. Looking back, I can identify the exact moment the ground shifted, though I did not recognize it at the time. It was about 18 months into our marriage, a Sunday dinner at her house in Evanston. She had made pot roast, and she asked me, very pleasantly, whether I had considered speaking with someone about my difficulty getting pregnant. We had not been trying. We had been actively not trying, because Daniel and I had agreed to wait another year. I told her that. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his plate. And then she said, "Well, of course, you're both so busy." I went home that night and wrote the conversation down in the Notes app on my phone. I am a detail-oriented person by nature. 4 years of working in physical therapy will do that to you. You learn to document, to track, to notice patterns. I had been documenting Margaret's comments for months by then, mostly as a way of processing them, the same way you might journal about a stressful week. I did not know yet that I was building a record. I thought I was just coping. Then we found out I was pregnant. I was 30 years old. It was a Monday morning in February, and I stared at the test for a long time before I let myself feel anything, because the first thing I felt before the joy, before the excitement was a strange, cold awareness that this information was going to change my relationship with Margaret in ways I could not yet predict. I pushed that feeling down. I told Daniel that evening over dinner, and he cried, which made me cry, and for a few weeks everything felt genuinely beautiful. We told Margaret together, at her house. On the following Sunday, I watched her face very carefully when Daniel said the words. There was a fraction of a second, less than a second, almost nothing, where something moved across her expression that was not happiness. Then she smiled and stood up and hugged Daniel and said she was overjoyed. She hugged me too, briefly, and said that this was wonderful news and that she hoped everything went smoothly. The way she said smoothly lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind and stayed there. In the weeks that followed, she was attentive in a way she had never been before. She called more often. She sent articles about prenatal nutrition. She invited us to dinner every week and always had something she had cooked specifically for me, a soup, a casserole, a tea she had blended herself from a recipe she said her own mother had used during her pregnancies. She pressed it on me warmly and consistently, and I drank it because I was genuinely trying to build something better between us. I told myself that the pregnancy had softened her. I told myself that people could change. I was about 10 weeks along when I started feeling wrong. Not wrong in a typical first trimester way. I had read enough to know the difference. This was a persistent dull nausea that was worse on the days after Margaret's dinners, a shakiness in my hands, a fatigue that felt less like tiredness and more like something pressing me down from the inside. My OB ran some routine panels and frowned at a few numbers she said were a little off, but probably nothing to worry about. I told myself she was right. I went home. I poured out the rest of the tea Margaret had given me because something in my body was telling me to, and I replaced it with ginger tea from the grocery store, and within 10 days I felt significantly better. I told myself it was a coincidence. But I kept the empty jar from Margaret's tea. I put it in the back of the cabinet under the bathroom sink, and I took a photograph of it, and then I sat on the bathroom floor for a while and thought very hard about what kind of person I was. Whether I was the kind of person who could think this about another person. Whether I was being paranoid and unfair, and frankly paranoid again. My husband's mother. A woman who went to church, who had raised Daniel, who had friends and a book club and a garden she was proud of. I put the photograph in a folder on my phone, and I went on with my life. At 14 weeks, Daniel came home from lunch with his mother, and told me, very gently, very carefully, that she had some concerns, not about the pregnancy itself, about me, about my work schedule and my stress levels and whether I was her word stable enough for everything ahead. He said it with such practiced gentleness that I could hear her coaching in every syllable. I looked at my husband across the kitchen, and I asked him whether he agreed with her, and he said, I just think it's worth hearing her out, and something between us cracked that I knew even then was not going to fully heal. That night, I set up a small audio recorder app on my phone, and I learned how to leave it running in my pocket without the screen being visible. I also, after a long and careful conversation with myself about whether this was reasonable, contacted a private lab about testing the contents residue in that jar. I want to be very clear that part of me hoped I was wrong. A very large part of me. I wanted the test to come back as nothing. I wanted to call the whole thing off and feel foolish and relieved and go back to just being someone who was going to have a baby. That is what I wanted. The results came back 10 days later. The residue in the jar contained elevated levels of pennyroyal and blue cohosh, both of which are herbal compounds with a long documented history of use as abortifacients. Substances that, in sufficient concentration, can cause miscarriage. I read the report 3 times. I forwarded it to my own email from my phone, I saved it to a cloud drive. I printed a copy and put it in an envelope, and I drove to my parents' house in Ohio without telling Daniel, and I sat at my mother's kitchen table and I finally let myself cry. My mother asked me once, when I had calmed down, what I wanted to do. Not what I should do, what I wanted. And I told her that I wanted my baby to be safe, and I wanted the truth to be known, and I wanted the people who were supposed to protect me to understand what they had failed to do. She nodded. She told me to be smart. She told me to document everything and to move slowly, and not to tip my hand before I was ready. I drove back to Chicago. I did not tell Daniel. Not yet. Because I had seen who he was in that kitchen conversation, and I needed to know, before I said anything, whether he would stand next to me or whether he would find a way to stand slightly to the side. I made an appointment with a family law attorney the following week. I did not tell Daniel where I was going. My attorney was a woman named Patricia, about 50, with short gray hair and the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of watching people make irreversible mistakes. I laid out everything for her: the tea, the lab results, the comments, the Sunday dinners, the gradual escalation, the conversation about my stability. She listened without interrupting. Then she told me two things. First, that what I had described, if proven, was criminal intentional harm to a pregnant person carries serious charges in Illinois. Second, that before I went to the police, I needed to understand the full picture of what was being done to me. Because in her experience, Patricia said, when someone is this calculated, this patient, this organized, there is usually more than one front. That was when she asked me about our finances, our wills, our estate documents. I went home that afternoon and I looked, really looked, for the first time, with new eyes, at every document that had Margaret's fingerprints on it. And I found things I had signed without reading carefully enough, things Daniel had signed, things that had been presented to us over the years as routine family paperwork, updating beneficiaries, formalizing arrangements, standard estate planning that Margaret had helpfully coordinated because she had relationships with attorneys and knew how these things worked. What I found, across multiple documents, was a systematic and patient rewriting of our legal and financial situation in ways that would, upon Daniel receiving his inheritance, funnel a significant portion of that money into structures that Margaret continued to control, while simultaneously reducing any independent claim I had as a spouse. The envelope on my kitchen counter, left there by Daniel without explanation, passed to him by his mother, containing the latest round of documents she wanted us to sign. A trust amendment on official letterhead that Patricia later told me was designed to ensure that in the event of divorce or my death, I or my estate would receive nothing from the inheritance. I sat in the chair by the window. I drank my coffee. I thought, then I called Patricia back and I asked her how we do this right. The answer was, carefully, quietly, and in the correct sequence. First, I went to the police. I brought the lab report, I brought the photograph of the jar, I brought my documented medical records showing the abnormal panels and the subsequent improvement. A detective named Reyes took my statement. He was thorough, and he did not make me feel foolish, which I had been afraid of. He told me the investigation would take time. I told him I had time. Second, I went back to Patricia, and we began building the civil case around the fraudulent documents, which involved a forensic document examiner, and a lengthy and expensive process of establishing what had been altered and when and by whose instruction. This part was harder. This part cost me more sleep. Third, and this was the hardest of all, I told Daniel. Not everything at once. I told him about the documents first, because those affected him directly, because I needed to see whether he was complicit or simply willfully blind. He went very pale. He asked me 3 times if I was sure. I showed him the documents and Patricia's analysis side by side and watched his face while he read, and what I saw there was not guilt. It was the specific devastation of a person whose most fundamental assumption about the world, that his mother loved him more than she loved anything else, had just been quietly dismantled. He was not a villain. He was something in some ways more frustrating. A man who had loved his mother so completely and so uncritically that he had never once looked at her clearly. And that blindness had almost cost me everything. He asked what he could do. I told him. I needed him to cooperate fully with the legal process. I needed him to not contact his mother. I needed him to understand that I was not doing this to punish him, but that I was not going to protect her. And if standing next to me meant not standing next to her, then that was the choice in front of him, and I needed him to make it consciously, not accidentally. He made it. It took him a week of the worst conversations we have ever had, but he made it. Margaret was arrested on a Thursday morning in early spring. I was 24 weeks pregnant. She was charged with intentional poisoning, causing harm to a pregnant person, which under Illinois law carries penalties that are not small. The fraudulent document case moved more slowly, as civil matters do, but it moved. Her attorney, a very good attorney actually, because Margaret had always known which resources to invest in, argued that the tea was a family remedy, that she had no idea of the chemical properties, that she had meant only kindness. Detective Reyes presented the purchase records for the specific herbal compounds found on a credit card she had used at a specialty botanical supplier 8 weeks into my pregnancy. The jury was not persuaded by her explanation. I want to tell you that the night the verdict came in, I felt triumph. I want to say it was cinematic. The truth is, I sat in my car in the parking garage outside the courthouse, and I put both hands on my very round stomach, and I felt something quieter than triumph and more permanent. I felt safe. I felt like the walls I had been holding up for months could finally come down because the danger was actually, provably, legally gone. My daughter was born 6 weeks later. She is the single most astonishing person I have ever met in my life, and she is only 18 months old, and she currently believes that the correct way to eat a strawberry is to hold it in your fist and walk around with it rather than actually consuming it. And I find this completely reasonable. Daniel and I separated 8 months after she was born. It was not dramatic. It was sad. The way honest endings are sad. He had been present and trying and genuinely remorseful, but there was a fundamental thing between us that had been revealed under pressure, and we both knew it. He had chosen correctly, ultimately, when it counted. But ultimately is a long time to wait for someone to choose you, and I had learned something important about what I needed from a partner, which was not someone who arrived at the right choice after agonizing deliberation. I needed someone who got there faster. Daniel and I co-parent our daughter with a level of civility that I am genuinely proud of. He is a good father. I have made my peace with that being enough. I run my own physical therapy practice now, 3 therapists on staff, a waiting list, an office I chose and decorated without asking anyone's opinion. My daughter comes to the office on Friday afternoons and sits on a blanket in the corner and redistributes the toys in her bag with great administrative seriousness. While I finish my notes, I have a good life. I have a life that is entirely mine. People ask me sometimes what I would tell my younger self, the woman who sat across the dinner table from Margaret and convinced herself that patience and warmth were enough to earn a place in a family. I would tell her to trust the feeling in her body. I would tell her that her instincts were not paranoia. I would tell her that the most dangerous thing a kind person can do is assume that everyone around them is operating in good faith, because that assumption will be used against you by the people who are not. Society tells women, specifically, to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to understand where difficult people are coming from, to forgive, to accommodate, to be the emotional labor of every room. And there is a version of that generosity, empathy, genuine understanding that I still believe in. But there is another version that is just survival of the person who is willing to do the most harm. And learning the difference between those two things was the education that changed my life. I am not grateful for what my mother-in-law did to me. I will never be grateful for that. But I am grateful for who I had to become in order to survive it. The woman who sat on her bathroom floor and asked herself hard questions and then stood up and made a decision. The woman who walked into a law office alone and laid her cards on the table. The woman who did not wait to be saved because she had already understood that waiting was the same as losing. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to document, to question, to walk out of rooms that are not safe for you. You are allowed to decide that a relationship, any relationship, no matter how it is labeled, is not worth more than your life or the life of your child. That is not cruelty, that is clarity. And clarity, I have learned, is the most valuable thing you can build in the aftermath of betrayal. I turned off my office light last night and looked out at the street below for a moment before I left the headlights moving through the dark, the ordinary and unremarkable world continuing, and I thought about how long I spent making myself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of who I should be. I will never do that again. Not for anyone. Not for any amount of peace that turns out not to be peace at all. Just the quiet of someone who has given up. If my story found you today, I want you to know that I see you. Whatever room you are sitting in right now, whatever you are telling yourself about keeping the peace or giving it time or not being sure enough to act, I see you. And I want to ask you something before you go. Have you ever had to choose yourself over someone who was supposed to choose you first? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to Recovery Stories for more. Your strength brought you here. Trust it.